Rose's Home Stores on Sheridan Drive?
Yes, fire department here immediately. We got a big fire in our store. Kenilworth, alarm of fire, 2880 Sheridan Drive, the Rose's store between Parkhurst and Hickory.
On April 3rd, 2001, a man died in the town of Tonawanda, New York. His name was Joe Moscato. He died in a fire. This is the story of that case. The saga started at about 4:20 in the afternoon on that day. It was a Tuesday. An alarm of fire came into the town of Tonawanda Fire Dispatch Center. The alarm was for the Rose's Home Center store, which had been located there for approximately 3 years. The structure had been rebuilt about 3 years earlier. The store sold bedding, electronics goods, furniture, that type of thing. The store was a very popular business, and what's of particular interest to why Joe Moscato died is the fact that it had been extensively remodeled about 3 years before the fire. At the time of the fire, the building enjoyed a certificate of occupancy which had been issued by the Town of Tonawanda Building Department. That certificate indicated that the building was in substantial compliance with applicable provisions of the New York State Uniform Fire Prevention and Building Code. Some geography is probably helpful as we look at the case. Rose's was located at the east end of the town of Tonawanda. Tonawanda is a middle-class suburb located north of Buffalo in Erie County. To the west is the Niagara River. The town of Amherst is to the east. The area is served by several volunteer fire departments. Kenilworth was the first fire company in. Kenilworth had 3 pumpers, 58 members, and was commanded by Chief Bill Swanson. Swanson had been a firefighter for many years, and at the time of this fire had been chief for about 9 years. He was experienced and no stranger to the fire service. Kenilworth was on the scene in minutes after they received the alarm.
At the time of the alarm of fire, I was at my home, which is approximately about 6/10 of a mile from there. When I got in the car and responded, which only took me a few seconds, by the time I got probably 3/4 or about half a mile from the store, I could see the heavy black smoke already. So I knew we had a working fire. So I called over a working fire. As I proceeded up the street, I got to Sheridan Drive in Parkhurst, which is only 1 block away from Rose's. I could see that all hell broke out. At that point, I called over and said I was attempting a rescue, and put my gear on, which is our procedure. Everybody has to have their turnout gear on. I tried to go to the door, swoop around, size it up, so when the guys got there, because I had a truck on the road already, one of the employees was yelling that the manager was still in the store. Actually, I didn't know it was the manager at that point. They just kept saying that Joe was inside the store. I proceeded to go through the atrium of the front doors, myself with 2 paramedics behind me. The paramedics stayed at the atrium doors. I went in through the main doors of the atrium, and all I could do was get down on my hands and knees and sweep my arms around to see if I could feel anybody, because the conditions were so heavy, the smoke, that I couldn't see anything. I think about it every day, and I wish I knew where he was, because I'm not saying I could have found him, but there was a good chance I might have been able to if I would have went farther.
At this point in the case, it's probably helpful to discuss the history of the building. About 3 years before the fire, it was extensively remodeled. This remodeling required some structural changes on the front and side of the building. It was expanded pretty significantly from a footprint standpoint. Structural members were changed. All of this required building permits.
The first thing that came to my mind was the building looked like a tomb. I didn't see a lot of glass windows. I didn't see a lot of doors. This had nothing to do with what's required. It had everything to do with being a firefighter and knowing what you have to do to evacuate people, to get rid of the hot smoke and gases that are going to kill people and make it very difficult for the firefighters. There were no windows to smash. One of the first things we as firefighters do is break out the windows to speed up the evacuation of smoke and gases. and it would have been very difficult for these firefighters. They did an admirable job for the conditions they were dealt.
Greg Gillis is an engineer. He is a professor at Erie Community College here in Erie County. He has worked with New York State's fire prevention and building code for almost 4 decades, and he's an expert in code compliance. He helped us put together this case as we went forward with a wrongful death claim for Linda Moscato, Joe Moscato's wife.
When they first put on the additions, the building actually expanded in 2 directions. It expanded towards the east and towards the north. This plan was gone over by someone, and there's a note here that the fire area exceeds the allowable. If you add up these proposed addition, the existing space, and the other proposed addition, you actually come up with 38,278 square feet. Now, with the building code, the maximum allowable, given every allowance there is in the code, that would have been 36,000. So it does exceed it.
When you develop a fire case, it's very important to make sure that there's a feeling for the structure and how it's laid out. The front entrance of Rose's was located here at the southeast corner of the building. As you move west along Sheridan Drive, you first see another retail establishment called Daddy's Junkie Music, and then an outfit called DeJory Insurance. There was an unoccupied office at the actual southwest corner of the structure. The west side of the structure was basically a straight run of concrete block. It was a wall running north. A parking lot flanked a portion of the north end of this wall. You can see it here. A lawn owned by a neighboring church bordered most of the west wall. And this was up near the Sheridan Drive section of the structure. The whole north wall of the structure abutted a parking lot. The north wall was also made of concrete block. It did have one overhead garage door and an emergency exit pedestrian door located on the west side right here. As you continue around the building, there was a diagonal wall which runs along Eggert Road. This wall had only one emergency door. The fifth side of the building ran basically north-south back to the main entrance. These walls were all made of concrete block. The roof trusses, the columns and beam were steel.
We attempted an interior attack through the whole thing, but it was kind of tough because of the conditions. So we had to get a roof crew up on top and make a channel cut. Eventually we ended up with 7 working companies, 2 fast team companies, and a total of 14 pieces of equipment.
Once the fire was out, law enforcement officials took control of the scene. Joe Moscato's body was found almost immediately. Dennis Carson is a fire investigator with the town of Tonawanda. He was on the scene throughout the entire investigation. He was also there when Joe Moscato's body was found.
We discovered Mr. Moscato's body approximately 15 feet inside the main entrance. His body was on the floor and showed evidence of thermal radiation, thermal trauma. The area where Mr. Moscato was located indicated heat radiation from the ceiling level, but comparatively little damage to furniture, carpeting, and other flammables near the floor. Given the size of the structure, the monetary damage, the obvious fatality to Mr. Moscato, we contacted ATF for assistance in the cause and origin investigation. ATF responded with their national response team and were on location in less than 10 hours.
Fire investigators quickly determined the fire's origin. They used line-of-sight tapes to confirm where the fire was first seen by Rose's employees. Basically, they used the tapes to line up where the fire was seen and where the employees were standing. The origin was in this area, along the diagonal portion of the building which abutted Eggert Road. It was right against the exterior block wall.
You'll notice it's heavily partitioned. There's a lot of walls, partitions, passageways.
The lower area where the fire started was obstructed from immediate view due to vertical walls that were used as part of the sales display. These walls were used to set off showroom displays and to isolate various types of furniture.
We immediately interviewed all employees and customers present in the store on the day of the fire. Based upon the eyewitness accounts, there was no question as to the area of origin. We also carefully interviewed the last 3 employees who escaped the fire. They were the last employees to see Mr. Moscato alive. ATF also brought in an accelerant detection canine. We were able to rule out all accidental and natural fire causes. ATF's team was very thorough in their examination of the scene. The fire was ruled incendiary in nature, which made this a possible homicide.
William Dill responded to the fire scene almost immediately. He brought his fire dog, Glitter. Bill was a 31-year veteran of the Buffalo Fire Department and commanded its arson squad for many years. He responded as part of ATF's National Response Team.
When we finally had the opportunity to get into the scene, it was the ATF agent in charge rendered the place safe. I took the dog in. We worked this scene on and off for over 2 hours. During that particular time, Glitter had no positive alerts, which means that she might have detected some type of accelerant. And it was our determination at the end of the search by Glitter that there was no accelerant used. There was no pour pattern evident at all inside the building. When the building was completely cleaned out, we determined there was actually only one point of origin, which was in the juvenile bedding section. And again, we saw no evidence of an accelerant being used. It looked like strictly ordinary combustibles were ignited. But we used Glitter for the reason to try to eliminate the use of any accelerants.
ATF's team was very thorough in their examination of the scene. They went through the scene with a fine-tooth comb. All investigators that were involved in the investigation felt comfortable in agreeing that the fire was incendiary in nature.
At the time of the fire, the interior northwest portion of the building contained 2 walls. One ran east-west for 29 feet, the other one north-south for 72 feet. This enclosed portion was a loading area and a small interior warehouse space used for storing crated furniture. This side of the wall was the showroom. This is the showroom. The means of egress from the showroom, there were actually 2, but one was near the fire. One was over here. This was a door that was added because the travel distance was too great when the plans were reviewed. The other one, means of egress from the showroom, was into the warehouse. But the warehouse doors opened inward into the showroom area. So these were not fire doors, they were not fire rated, they weren't self-closing. And when the 2 gentlemen opened these doors, the warehouse was already full of smoke.
At this point, we knew from eyewitnesses that smoke conditions in the showroom, even 10 minutes after the fire was discovered, were not all that bad. There was some wispy smoke up near the ceiling, but we also knew there was no immediate loss of the fluorescent lighting over the showroom during the very early stages of the fire. No banking smoke under the showroom ceiling was visible until only a second or 2 before the last surviving employee escaped. We had testimony from the wrongful death claim which showed what happened when the 2 doors were opened between the showroom and the warehouse where these 2 employees escaped when they made their exit from the building.
Well, I could see the door as I was walking to it. You know, when I was directly towards the door, I could see the warehouse door. I mean, it was smoking actually on the other side of the building. Once the door was open, I couldn't see anything. No, he never left the building. Because I was in the building with him. I was the last one to talk to him. I told him, "You gotta get the hell out of here."
Elliot had no reason to be evasive. He remembered clearly what happened when the double doors to the warehouse were open. Elliot thought that Joe Moscato was somewhere behind him when Elliot escaped with another employee through the warehouse double doors. These 2 employees eventually made it out the emergency door on the north side of the building. Witnesses noticed immediately after their escape that their heads and upper body were heavily covered with soot. We also knew from the last surviving employee who got out the front door down near Sheridan Drive that smoke conditions in the showroom changed dramatically only a second or 2 before he escaped. John Mickler was that employee. He was a salesman for roses.
When I got to the business counter, again, people were yelling, "Is everybody out? Let's get people out." A couple of salespeople had fire extinguishers, and we just said, "Look, let's get out of here." I went to the business counter. I dialed 911.
911, 10 up, 10 Wanda. Yeah, this is Rose's Home Store on Sheridan Drive. Yes. A fire in the building? Yes, sir. Advise everybody get out. I need your name, please. It's John Mickler. John, any idea where exactly it's located? It's in the bedroom department. It's really out of control. All right, get everybody out, sir. Okay, they're out of the building.
So I looked, and the front door, we could still see. There was light in the building, but it wasn't store conditions in the building. So, and it was 4 in the afternoon, so in April there was still light coming in from outside and what have you. So I just started to walk towards the front door. At that point I assumed Joe was behind me or somewhere behind me. I walked down through the center of the store, which was, it's divided by an aisleway and there's furniture on both sides. And I was just walking, just figuring I was just going to get to the front door and walk out. When I got to the front business counter, at that point there was some smoke like rolling on the ceiling, a little bit, I could notice. And suddenly, at that point, I'm maybe 30 to 40 feet from the front door, and suddenly at that point, like snapping your fingers, the smoke dropped from the ceiling and it was down to like my waist, my knees, and it was, I made maybe 2 steps through the smoke. And at that point, I just put my hands up so I didn't walk into the door frame, and I picked my pace up a little. I knew right where I was. I was in a straight line direction to the front door. I got to the door frame. I got myself out and through the inside doors and the outside doors. At that point, I waited outside for Joe to come out. I figured he was right behind me, and that never happened. He never came out. And
at this point, we had a pretty good idea of where the employees were right before they escaped from the building. Elliot and the other employee who escaped out the back of the building saw him about here. Mickler knew that Joe was behind him approximately here when Mickler headed for the front door. All 3 employees thought Joe Moscato was following behind them. Mickler heard the last thing Joe Moscato said.
He was asking, where are people? Are people out of the building? And knowing Joe as I did, there's no way he was going to leave the store and leave anybody in that store. You know, if he had anything to do with it, he wasn't going to do that.
Photos showed the remnants of a suspended ceiling grid over the showroom. The ceiling varied in height depending on what area we're in. The ceiling over the origin point was only about a foot above 8-foot walls, which subdivided the showroom. If you look closely at the ceiling suspension grid, you can see that the showroom ceiling was not fire rated. No hold-down clips are visible. The building permit approved by the local inspector called for 2A construction. A 2A classification requires a 3/4-hour fire rating for ceilings. The entire ceiling over the showroom and obviously over the origin of fire was not fire rated. Once the fire started, there was nothing to prevent the flame and hot gases from impinging on the ceiling where it met the outside wall. From there, smoke and gases entered the plenum between the ceiling and the roof.
Ken Pearl is a New York architect. He was hired as an expert in our civil claim on behalf of the Moscato estate. He is an expert in fire code compliance and building renovation.
The ceiling was simply a normal ceiling that you would see in any type of construction project, offices, some retail space. It's what we call a suspended ceiling. It's simply a light gauge aluminum frame, and then it has these composite panels that hang in the ceiling, and then periodically you see a light fixture or you see a heating register or something in that same grid pattern. The problem with it was that under normal construction, that would have been identified as 2B construction, non-rated, nothing special about it. It just solves the construction purposes it was intended to. When they shifted the plan to being a 2A submission, that ceiling was required as part of some other assemblies to be upgraded to a fire-resistive construction, which meant it had a significant burden on it to have different performance characteristics. None of that work was done. That was the big highlight in our review, was that this was the first telltale symptom of what was submitted to comply with the building department's requirements and the code's requirements, That was the first clue to us that a lot of those things that were promised weren't done. The fire should not have been able to punch up through that simple grid system so quickly. It should have had some type of barrier to hold it at bay for a period of time. The idea is that that's a big open cavity. That's a whole big room in and of itself that's only 2 or 3 feet tall above that ceiling. And the idea is you want to keep the fire out of there because that's where it's going to grow. That's where the heat's going to grow. That's where you're not going to see it growing.
What we knew at this point is why smoke and gases had migrated up into the plenum at the early stages of the fire. What this didn't explain is why there was heavy black soot and smoke on the far side of the door Elliot and the other employee used to escape when they ran out the back of the building. Rick Shia is a fire investigator. He was hired by one of the parties to the civil litigation. Shia is a former chief of the Niagara Falls Fire Department. He was a fire investigator with Niagara Falls for about 7 years. Even though the investigation he conducted was limited, he showed the natural curiosity all good fire investigators bring to their job.
On one of my trips inside the building, I had a new camera, and it was very dark in there on this day, so I thought this would be a good opportunity to see how the camera, using 400 speed film, would capture the conditions that existed. Even in the total blackness, the flash and the type of film were able to capture views of the interior of the structure, and in particular the back wall that separated the showroom from the warehouse. And this later on turned out to be a very interesting photo of this area. Smoke and soot entered the warehouse primarily from the top of the wall that wasn't sealed. If it had been sealed, it would have greatly reduced the smoke and soot that entered the warehouse area.
Specifically, he took several photographs which turned out to be critical in understanding one of the key links of what happened before Joe Moscato got trapped. Once our lawsuit was filed, literally hundreds of photos and blueprints became available for review through discovery. We were lucky to have this proof. The entire interior of the store had been gutted before we could assign an investigator to try to determine how smoke migrated into the warehouse. It's important to remember that authorities concentrate on the origin of the fire, not distant smoke patterns, which only became important months later. Important evidence of this nature came from many sources. One of them turned out, ironically, to be the public adjuster for Rosa's store. National Fire Adjustment Company was retained by Paul Rosa, the actual owner of the building, to assist with the property claims against Rosa's insurance carrier. NFA is a large public adjusting firm which is based in Amherst. It has been doing business for 91 years. Given the size of the loss, Angelo Puccio, NFA's Buffalo manager, personally examined the site.
We take an inventory of all the damaged items that are on location. We document and estimate the building damages, and in part of that process is taking photographs or movies, whichever we think would be more helpful, video of the damages, whether it be the building, the contents, the stock, whatever. Especially in a case where there's this much devastation, you know that a building very soon is going to be knocked down and demolished, and if there's a question as to how badly something's damaged, it's good to have a photo record of all that. So we take pictures of everything. In this particular case, there were some pictures that were taken in the rear of the building. There was a warehouse or storage area, and it was maybe a small portion of the building. They didn't do a lot of storage right there or warehousing on location, but it was an area that was separated from the showroom, and while it was a good deal away from the source of the fire, it was an area where a lot of stock was piled. So there was a great deal of money in that back room. So what I had done is taken some photographs to show that that room actually had been smoke damaged. Even though the doors were closed, there was smoke that had gotten in there. And I wanted to show that even though the firewall was up, smoke got into that area, and we had a lot of damaged inventory in there. And in the course of their investigation, Mr. Moscato's people found that those photographs showed that there was that area wasn't sealed and there was a way for smoke to move across the building in different areas. Everybody thought had been sealed.
What I've attempted to do is reconstruct the conditions that were present in the warehouse and the showroom at the fire. The wall that was supposed to be a firewall really wasn't a firewall, because a firewall is supposed to be tight. In other words, smoke cannot migrate through it. But because of the way the bar joists were situated, and the photos show that the roof deck actually went across the firewall like this, and there's openings up here that the smoke could migrate through. Now, these openings are supposed to be tight. The openings at the fire were not. I sealed the ones on this side, but they're not sealed on that side. This is the way the firewall, supposed firewall, was. There were also openings for duct and conduit in the firewall which weren't sealed. Now, a firewall has to seal and stop that smoke from migrating. So I've tried to reconstruct the conditions here. There was a ceiling which was not fire rated in the showroom, and the smoke went into this cavity above the ceiling and then went over this wall into the warehouse area, so that when they opened the doors to the warehouse was full of smoke. The doors themselves were not fire rated. They opened into the showroom, and they were not fire rated. They didn't have self-closing mechanisms, and they weren't sealed properly. So what I'm going to try to do here today is I have some paper in a basket, which I'm going to set on fire. I've got some insulation board. Now, we know that there was insulation board on the walls above the ceiling, and in fact it was on the entire wall. It was covered with drywall at some point, but we don't know if it was covered all the way up to the top. And set this on fire. We'll see if we can produce some smoke that'll migrate over the top. I'll seal it up, and we'll see if we get some smoke. As you can see, we've got a ton of smoke coming out through that wall. I believe this is pretty close what happened in that fire. There was smoke in this wall cavity above the ceiling, and the smoke was just pouring into the area of the warehouse. So when they opened the doors to the warehouse was full of smoke, and there was no escape.
An enlargement of the NFA photo of the back of the warehouse showed much more than loose drywall tape and staining from soot and smoke. If you look carefully, you can see the bar joists which support the roof in the south portion of the warehouse are running north to south. This was contrary to the structural steel blueprints which were submitted to the local building inspector, which showed the joists running east to west. We're now in this section of the building. The NFA photograph showed the roof pans were going east-west from the outside wall. After the Shia photos were enlarged and placed next to the NFA photo, we were able to conclusively demonstrate the roof pan flutes were at right angles with the north-south wall between the showroom and the warehouse. It turned out that the entire wall, which separated the warehouse from the showroom, was open at the top from the spaces created by the roof pan flutes. This wall was not even close to being smoke tight. In addition, there were outright holes in the wall between the ceiling and the roof coming from the showroom side. These holes were around electrical conduits and an HVAC duct which ran across the back of the warehouse and into the showroom. These openings allowed large amounts of smoke to migrate into the warehouse under pressure from the origin site of the fire. At this point, the mystery of how smoke could migrate from the far side of a firewall into the warehouse was solved. We knew why expanding smoke and gases immediately filled the plenum over the showroom. That was evident from what we knew of the origin of the fire. We now also knew why smoke traveled over and through the wall into the warehouse. This still didn't explain why there was a rapid onrush of smoke and soot back into the showroom from the warehouse when the double doors were open. The final key to the puzzle turned out to be a simple overhead garage door located at the north end of the warehouse.
There was so much soot in the warehouse and yet so little actual fire damage. So you're trying to figure out how could we get this much soot in this area. You could actually walk on the floor and leave footprints in the settled soot.
Large blow-ups of photos on the north end of the building showed unusual smoke staining on the overhead garage door panels and at the lower portion of the door frame. You can see them here and here. If you look closely, you can see that there's faint smoke staining near the lower right door frame. It's also visible on the concrete block in the same area. Soot staining on the top two garage door panels is noticeably darker than the bottom two panels. These observations were critical to determine that the garage door was partially open when the two employees opened the double doors.
It would have created almost a sucking vacuum type situation in a fire. Because of the introduction of heat, it changes the normal currents that would exist when a building's not burning. You have a great deal of heat generated, heat rises, and all of a sudden now all of your traditional concepts are changed because you have currents that are different than normal heating conditions. And in addition, in this particular fire, the heating ventilation system shut down very early in the fire, which would have further compounded the buildup of smoke and gases.
One of the first firefighters driving to the scene came in from Eggert Road on the north of the building. He had a clear view of the north side of the building as he approached. Even at that very early point in the fire, there was no noticeable smoke coming from under the garage door. We could then conclude, even at the very early stages of the fire, after the double doors were open and after it was reported, no smoke was coming from the back of the building. This meant the smoke staining on the garage door up near the top and down low near the door frame occurred at the fire's earliest stages. Soot and smoke staining on the top two panels of the garage door was obviously much heavier than the rest of the garage door. This came from these panels being parallel to the roof of the warehouse as soot descended and settled out on those top two panels. The bottom two panels had virtually no staining and were vertical during the early stages of the fire. From the smoke staining located near the bottom of the door frame, we knew the garage door was partially open at the very early stages of the fire. We also knew hot air, soot and smoke forcibly blew back into the showroom when the two employees opened the double doors. Suddenly, there was no longer a question of what happened and why Joe Moscato died. What happened became very clear when we put everything together sequentially. When the two employees escaped from the showroom, the double doors leading from the showroom swung open back into the showroom from the warehouse. These doors were not fire doors and they were not spring-loaded. Once they were opened, they stayed open. We now knew from smoke staining that the garage door was partially open at the early stages of the fire before Elliot opened the double doors. Here's what happened from start to finish. During the early stages of the fire, smoke and gases quickly flowed from the seat of the fire up into the plenum. They then migrated well beyond what was supposed to be a smoke-tight firewall. From that point, the smoke banked down from the warehouse roof. There was no ceiling in the interior warehouse area, so the smoke was able to quickly fill the entire warehouse without anything stopping it. Eventually, it started coming out from under the bottom of the partially open garage door. This created heavy smoke and soot conditions in the warehouse, even though the showroom itself, where the fire was burning, only had light smoke near the ceiling. It also left telltale smoke stains on the garage door frame that we looked at earlier. The moment the double doors were opened, fresh air from outside was sucked under the garage door and through the now open double doors into the showroom where the fire was burning. What happened when those double doors were opened and oxygen rushed back toward the seat of the fire would be obvious to any seasoned firefighter. Mike Lombardo is a captain with the Buffalo Fire Department. He is highly decorated, and he is also a survivor of a flashover.
If a trained firefighter was in that place at that time, they may not be able to do much about it because of the size of that place. That was a very large, uncompartmented building, most of it. It was not sprinklered, so they wouldn't have been able to do much, but they might have known, a firefighter would know what was about to happen, and it wouldn't be good at all. There's a lot of things we teach firefighters that are important for their survival. One of the things is when we go into a place with a false ceiling like that, we teach firefighters to punch a hole in the ceiling as they enter it. In other words, if I was at a doorway here and I opened it up to a large open space with a false ceiling and there was a fire somewhere in the building, I would open up that ceiling a little bit to see, holy cow, there's heavy heat and smoke all the way to here, or there's nothing at all. So we would train firefighters to do that. The other thing is that firefighters would go in with a large caliber hand line, a 2.5-inch hand line, for instance, so that they could have the penetration and reach of the water so that they could move in there and get water up into that overhead as well as the deep distance that was inside that building.
It's important to remember the fire burned before the 911 call went out, and for some additional period of time as the fire was fought by employees. Throughout these first few minutes, smoke and gases rapidly build up between the ceiling and the roof. The gases were flammable. We know they had already filled the plenum space even before the double doors were opened. We also know why the smoke migrated into the warehouse. All that was needed was a triggering event to create a flashover. In this fire, it was when the two doors to the warehouse were opened and fresh air was allowed to feed the fire from its base up into the ceiling and throughout the dead space over the entire showroom. We know at one point Joe Moscato tried to escape from the building through the double doors near the warehouse. We also know later that his body was found near the front door near Sheridan Drive. Something during the course of that fire made him retreat from those double doors and head toward the front of the building where he was ultimately trapped and died.
A fire doesn't double in size, let's say. In other words, when we have a fire, it's over here in a corner, okay? When it grows exponentially. What we mean is 1 minute it's this big, the next minute it's 8 times bigger, the next minute it's 64 times bigger, the next minute it's 128 times bigger, and so on and so forth. In other words, it's not growing linearly, getting bigger, 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 bigger. It's growing exponentially. Being disoriented, being in horrendous conditions, burning, not being able to get a breath, suffocating. Mr. Moscato started to probably became disoriented very quickly and started to retrace his steps, move around a little bit, and he was no more than 10 to 20 feet from the entrance of the store when he was found. But that might as well have been a mile.
I saw the vestibule full up, and it just kind of came right at me, and it dropped from, it was clear as day to the point I almost couldn't see my hand in front of my face in less than a second. And I simply looked towards the front door, and I saw a very clear, easy access or egress out of the building, and I chose to go towards the front, and 2 others chose to go towards the back. And I thought Joe was behind me, they thought he was behind them, and so somewhere he was in the middle of the store. And I got out, and unfortunately he didn't. And but it could have been worse. It could have been much, much more. Knowing what we know today, if we all would have waited 10 more seconds, there'd have been several deaths in that.
Once we ultimately figured out what happened, a claim was brought on behalf of the Moscato family against a number of parties. If you can show negligence, New York law permits recovery for pure economic damages for the survivors. It also allows for damages for conscious pain and suffering. Mrs. Moscato and her children brought a claim against the architect who had designed the expansion project. The contract manager who actually supervised the construction was also named. Finally, we brought a claim against the subcontractor who built the interior warehouse walls and installed the ceiling. Ironically, the Moscato estate was unable to bring a claim against the actual building owner, Paul Rosa. Paul Rosa and Joe Moscato were employed by the same company, namely Rosa's Incorporated. Under New York law, you can't sue a co-employee if you accept workers' comp benefits. Rosa's Incorporated, the corporation that owned the business, was, however, brought back into the litigation by the other defendants we sued on what's known as a theory of contribution. In New York State, the pattern jury instruction actually permits proof of code violations as evidence of negligence. The theory behind the wrongful death claim for the Moscato family was simple. There was no sprinkler system in the building at the time of the fire. According to the applicable codes, there should have been a fire sprinkler system. If the building had a proper fire sprinkler system, the odds were virtually certain that Joe Moscato would not have perished in this fire. It then became important from a legal standpoint to identify building and fire code violations.
It was built or designed and constructed and submitted for a building permit way in excess of an allowable fire area. That could have been solved with a few minor alterations to the building type and simply putting in the sprinkler system. They chose not to put the sprinkler system in. What they chose to do was make the building more, they tried to improve the performance characteristics of the building. They tried to say it was a better construction type. They tried to say there was better access. They tried to show some subdivided walls and things that, in the final review of things, those features that were promised and discussed, A, they barely made the compliance with the code, and then B, they didn't get built. Most of them were just simply put on paper as a promise, but the construction itself didn't occur, or it didn't occur to the performance level that the code required. Our findings show that the building did not have a sprinkler system because fire areas were inaccurately calculated. Our findings included really three major points. The higher construction rating of 2A was not built. The bonus credit for additional fire area based on them having exterior firefighting access was too generous. And then the barriers used to subdivide the fire areas, the walls and partitions that were built in, were actually built as fire separations. They were built as fire separations instead of what's considered a more sophisticated construction type known as fire walls. When the plans for the Rosa's expansion were submitted, it was quickly determined by the code officials that the building was over the allowable fire areas, that the building was too big for the fire areas for what they wanted to do. And there was a process you could see in the margins of the drawings where suggestions were being made on how to solve it, where code enforcement folks were highlighting back that something wasn't in compliance. The building ended up, I think, was in the Rosa's tenant space itself was in the vicinity of 38,000 square feet, which under the most generous interpretations of the code was still about 2,000 square feet over what the math allowed. So the margins were still, even being generous, the margins still were in excess of what was allowed. And in the end, somehow it was determined that a sprinkler system wasn't required and that full compliance with the code wasn't required in terms of the alternative ideas they were coming up with.
When the building permit was issued for the Rosa's expansion and remodeling, the permit recited 35,931 square feet as the fire area of the building. This was only a hair below what the code would have required to install a sprinkler system. The end result was this building was remodeled and renovated and had no active fire sprinkler system.
The problem was that I have 3 sets of drawings. All of them have different square footages for that space. So we decided that how would we determine exactly what the space was? So we went to the surveyor's drawings and the steel erector's drawings. Now the steel erector, when a steel erector puts a building together, he has a beam and a column. Everything has to fit, and that bolt, when it hits the hole, has to slip right through there. So the steel erector drawings are usually taken as being very accurate. The dimension lines on the architect's drawings didn't all add up. So we decided to go with the steel erector's drawings and the surveying drawings and actually reproduce the space on AutoCAD so that we could more accurately determine exactly how many square foot was in there. When we recreated the space, this is the warehouse and this is the warehouse area. The warehouse area wasn't shown on any of the drawings except the drawings from the interior designer, which was Curtis Randall. This space here, using the surveyor's dimensions and the steel erector's dimensions, we calculated, even taking the warehouse out, we calculated the remaining space to be over the limit.
They had carved it out as a separate fire space. They established that the walls that were part of that new warehouse area that separated the warehouse from the retail side would be fire separations. The problem was that for fire areas, you have to subdivide the building with fire walls, not fire separations, and that really became kind of a key problem.
For starters, two-way construction requires that vertical columns have a 2-hour fire rating. They have to be rated to the roof, or at a minimum, as was the case here, up to the ceiling, if the ceiling is fire rated. We know the ceiling wasn't fire rated, neither were the columns. As you can see from the photos, the drywall and the columns stopped at the ceiling, and they were bare to the roof. As a result, the building did not qualify for two-way construction on this basis alone. The way that the wall was built, and it was brought up to the roof pans, left these openings at the top of the wall where the smoke was just free to migrate from the showroom area ceiling cavity over into the warehouse, filling the warehouse with smoke. If the wall was built right to there, running in this direction, north-south direction, then it would have been sealed, or could have been sealed. As it was, the joists were actually running in the other direction. The joists were running in a north-south direction, therefore the deck was running in the east-west direction. So when the roof was built, it left these openings in each one of the flutes of the roof deck. So according to the eyewitnesses, that's why the smoke was escaping. The photographs confirm that, and the wall should have been built according to New York State Code and should have been smoke tight. For two-way construction in New York, the rating for a firewall and vertical columns is 2 hours. The drywall protects the columns and the walls, and the drywall itself is a good fire-resistant material. When I looked at the photographs, I saw that the openings for the ductwork and the conduits had smoke around the openings, which means that the openings were not sealed. There was, in some cases, it looked like there was duct tape on the wall, where the duct tape was actually melted. It was not sufficient to keep the smoke on one side of the wall and not let it migrate to the other side.
It finally turned out that the wall which separated the tenancies on Sheridan Drive and the Rose's store was also not a proper firewall. What is shown in the blueprints as a firewall right here was in reality only a fire separation. This meant that the entire footprint of the building was now part of the total fire area, which yielded a total square footage of over 50,000 square feet. This was over 14,000 square feet above the limit, which would have required this building to have a fire sprinkler.
The firewalls determine the floor area. In other words, if you have a big store and it's divided with firewalls, then the areas on either side of the firewalls constitute a fire area. In this case, the wall should have been designed so that if the roof structure on one side of the wall collapsed, the roof structure on the other side of the wall would remain stable. This wall wasn't done that way. When the plans were first submitted for this building, the travel distance to any exit cannot exceed 150 feet. In the plans that were submitted, the travel distance was considerably more than 150 feet. So there was a note on the drawing that said an additional exit had to be put in, and the exit was put against this wall here. The way the layout was, there was a lot of 8-foot walls partitioning off different areas. The exit along that wall that was added was obstructed with some materials, and the only way that the people who were in this fire could have escaped were through the wall that was into the warehouse. The other one was blocked by the fire itself and some material that was in that hallway. It wasn't a clear shot. In order to get through this place, it was almost like going through a maze, because there were all of these furniture displays, and the furniture displays made up rooms and took off sectional areas, and in order to get through this, especially in dense smoke, would have been extremely difficult.
The primary design entity that was involved in the second building permit package, which I think was $1 million or $1.2 million, was the established dollar amount in the permit application, just for phase 2 of the work, for the interior work. They were what it turned out to be was they were an interior design firm out of California that appeared to specialize in retail facilities, storefront, store work, and they shared their design work with different vendors, manufacturers of bedding systems or TV displays. They also provided some of their own interior design for their particular portion of the store. They were going to have their bedding display, so they had some work they were doing, millwork for displays and counters and wall systems. And then the interior designer was coordinating all this, but as an interior designer, really not as a code entity or code compliance. In fact, their drawings were pretty clear about indicating as much, that they weren't responsible for local code compliance. They weren't responsible for being the final legal entity who had liability for the project. Nobody picked up on that. The code enforcement accepted the drawings unstamped.
2A construction starts out limiting fire area to 18,000 square feet before you have to install sprinklers. You get a bonus or a multiplier up to 100% of the square footage if you have frontage or legal open spaces being defined as being at least 50 feet wide on 4 sides. On the west side of the building, there was a run of 120 feet where there was no right-of-way and no pavement. If it was raining, it's a fair question whether a responsible fire commander officer would order a pumper or aerial rig next to this building on a muddy lawn. Under a strict interpretation of the code, the multiplier should not have been 100%. In fact, at one time, the building was only allowed a 75% bonus because of this very problem. We believe this constituted an additional potential code violation.
We learned from employees there was not a single smoke detector in this store when it burned. That meant that the fire burned for approximately 10 minutes before it was discovered by employees. This 10-minute burn time was determined by ATF and the other fire investigators who worked the fire. No significant smoke presented in the showroom when the fire first started. This is because all the smoke and hot gases blew right through a non-rated suspended ceiling. Incredibly, there was no state or local law at the time that would have otherwise required smoke detectors to be in this retail store.
I am shocked. I was very shocked. I immediately, that's the first thing that came out of our mouths. Where were the sprinklers at the time? I mean, he should have gotten out of that building. Looking at it, we never even noticed there weren't any windows in it until you looked at it again. And I drove by there so many times after the fire to just look at the building and wonder how he couldn't get out of there, but there weren't any windows, there weren't any sprinkler systems.
The cost of this fire ran into the millions. It included the cost of the wrongful death settlement, property damage, and a whole bunch of legal fees. All of this could have been prevented with virtual certainty had there been a sprinkler system in this building when it burned. Steve Elmer is an officer with Davis Elmer Sprinkler Company. He is an expert in the installation of fire sprinkler systems. He is also a member of the National Fire Sprinkler Association.
A sprinkler system in a facility like Rose's, where we have a concern with fire not only below the ceiling but above the ceiling, would cost about $2 a square foot, or somewhere in the neighborhood of $75,000. Sprinkler system is the most effective way of combating a fire because it attacks a fire in its early stages. A relatively minor amount of heat is required to activate a sprinkler head, and the sprinkler head in effect puts droplets out in a pattern that not only suppresses the heat and the flame but also knocks down the smoke by removing the particles of smoke out of the air as the droplets are passing through it. There was a great probability that Mr. Moscato's life would have been saved because the fire would have been controlled in its early stages and an alarm sounded immediately. As soon as the first sprinkler head goes off, it is immediately quenching the fire, extinguishing the fire. It's also sounding an alarm, notifying the local authorities, so response times from the fire department are enhanced. There's no danger of employees trying to fight the fire and thinking they can put it out and causing a further delay with getting the authorities, rolling. There's two significant sized mains, one in Eggert and one in Sheridan Drive. They could have been easily accessible, and underground piping could have been brought into the most accessible spot of the store, providing enough water pressure and water volume to have an enhanced sprinkler system installed in that facility.
Given the fact that local authorities and ATF had called this fire an arson, some of the representatives on the other side of the negligence case suggested that a fire sprinkler system would not have made any difference. We knew that the fire was not accelerated even though it was an arson. Ironically, a fire sprinkler system would have put out an accelerated fire even quicker than a non-accelerated arson. John Vianello, president of the National Fire Sprinkler Association, understands the effectiveness of fire sprinklers, probably better than anyone in the United States.
Many people don't realize that fire sprinkler heads activate faster when a fire is accelerated. In other words, at an arson fire, especially when someone has attempted to accelerate the fire with a flammable liquid, the fire really gets knocked down by a sprinkler much quicker than a slower burning fire. The reason for this is that the activating mechanism within the sprinkler head goes off sooner because of the rapid buildup of heat which takes place when the fire is accelerated. Now in the Rosa fire, no accelerant was found. The fact that the fire may have been set as arson would have really no effect on whether a properly installed fire sprinkler system would have contained this blaze at its earliest stages. There's no question that a fire sprinkler system would have prevented a flashover.
Initially, this litigation started out as a complicated case. Eventually, the scientific and firematic conclusions proved to be quite simple. Basic fire suppression technology involving only pipes, water, and sprinkler heads would have prevented this tragedy and the millions of dollars in expense which followed. Fire sprinklers are effective, their technology is reliable, and they have been well proven over the last 100 years. These systems are cost effective, and the building codes which govern their use have been around for years. The importance of this simple message is now too late to do the Moscato family any good. As we have seen with recent events in Rhode Island, the difference between life and death in a fire can be measured in seconds. My clients, the Moscato family, authorized this documentary with the sincere hope another family will not go through what they did because a building lacked a fire sprinkler system when local codes clearly required it.
we were so empty, we wanted something of his. We just wanted his personal belongings, which we didn't get for a while, and missing him so much, we wanted to at least see the car in the backyard. 10 o'clock at night would come, and I'm like, okay, he's here, and the door would open, it wouldn't be him. But I still feel like that now. I open up, and the door opens at 9 or 10, I'm like, oh, maybe he's home early. And it's a strange feeling, that because he was right on time all the time. He was so dedicated to everything, and he was right on time. So I know, when he would come home. But I think my daughter just wanted to see his car in the backyard and, get that back for our last, I don't know.
Hi, it's Rose's Home Stores in Sheridan Drive. Yes, fire department here immediately. We got a big fire next door.
I saw smoke going up to the roof. Heavy, thick, black smoke.
It's in the store? Yes. All right, I want you to get everybody out. We are right now. Thank you. Thank you.
We respond to the large, they're often referred to in the fire service trade journals as big box stores. These monstrous open areas full of stock, full of merchandise that burns, full of flammables that is, ready to ignite. It's offering a tremendous amount of fuel. We have to look at that a little differently. We have to slow down a touch.
(911), 10 up, 10 Wanda. Yeah, this is Rose's Home Store on Sheridan Drive. There's a fire in the building.
I think about it every day, and I wish I knew where he was, because I'm not saying I could have found him, but there was a good chance I might have been able to if I would have went farther.
It's really out of control. All right, get everybody out, sir. Okay, they're out of the building.